You stand in a dimly lit chamber within Windsor Castle. Your eyes, heavy in the dying light, fix upon a motionless form lying on a narrow, ornate bed. The stillness is suffocating. A fine mist of stale floral and something foul, vaguely sickly and copper-tinged, clings to the air. You reach out, hesitant, and brush your fingers against damask. Beneath it, the cold, rigid cheek of the deceased presses into velvet. You realize, with a jolt of dread, that you are sleeping in the same room, perhaps mere feet from a corpse. This was Queen Victoria's reality after the death of Prince Albert. She insisted he remain beside her. His body prepared and placed in an adjoining room, separated by only a curtain. You feel the weight of grief, the echo of ritual, the scent of death that clings to royal chambers. You are not a tourist in time. You are a witness, and what you're about to remember may never leave you again. If you find yourself drawn to the shadows of history, if the quiet grief of a queen and the rituals of mourning stir your curiosity, subscribe and like, for facts that chill you to the bone are worth preserving. Stay silent, stay observant, but do not walk away. The truths unearthed here are your inheritance. You awaken in the autumn of 1861, a time when London's brisk air carries the fading scent of summer's roses and the approaching chill of winter. The year is 1861. The month November. You are present in the vast yet intimate royal apartments of Queen Victoria in Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. Britain stands poised at the height of its industrial, imperial confidence, steam engines power progress, and the empire's dominion spans continents. Yet behind the gilded curtain of progress lies a sorrow that chills the soul. You are not a courtier gawking from a distance, you are a silent, invisible companion at Queen Victoria's side in the most intimate grief. Prince Albert, her beloved husband and consort, architect of her domestic and political confidence, has fallen ill. The official records cite typhoid fever as the cause, a sudden, relentless fever accompanied by abdominal pain, vomiting, delirium, an all-too-human affliction amid grandeur. Nurses and physicians surround his bedside, speaking in hushed tones about his rapid decline and those final, labored breaths. All the while, Victoria remains near, never to leave his side. You, invisible, feel the air grow thick with scented oils, eucalyptus, laudanum, perhaps even camphor, to mask the harsh tang of decay before death arrives. Indeed, physicians of the era sometimes used aromatic substances to ease air around dying patients. Still, the scent of fear and anticipation lingers. You know how this scene unfolds because it is carefully chronicled. Victoria's journals, her letters to confidants, and later historians like Lytton Strachey, who bear witness to her undying attachment and her extraordinary behavior in the aftermath. Here, in this introduction, you are meant to understand the paradox. The age is one of progress, rationality, empire, yet also of lingering rituals of mourning, superstition, and overwhelming emotion. You breathe in the dissonance between public duty and private torment. The palace seems to hush itself in reverence to grief. Courtiers whisper outside closed doors. Candles flicker, casting moving shadows on floral wallpaper, death's annunciation. One historian calls it, the ticking of a distant clock becomes a metronome to your own shallow breath. You sense why this moment is more than personal sorrow. It is the uneasy collision of monarchy's weight and death's immutability. So you remain, not a historian, not a voyeur, but a witness. You feel the first crack in the polished facade of empire, the pulsing heart of Victorian Britain, that in all its optimism relied still on rituals of grief and the unspoken fear of mortality, beats faintly here. In this room, in this grief-stricken queen who would spend the remainder of her reign draped in black, you enter the cold stillness of December 1861. The great hall of Osborne House lies emptied of warmth. Only the canopy of frosted breath marks your passage. The air, tinged by wet wool, damp stone, and the faint residue of beeswax candles hangs weighty, almost tangible. You are drawn, unwavering, to one door. Beyond it, life is thinning. You stand as witness. You move into the blue room, where Prince Albert lies. On the evening of the 14th of December 1861, at 10:50 p.m., he breathed his last, struck down, officially, by typhoid fever. Though some accounts hint at deeper gastric ailments that physicians of the era could not untangle, his breath stopped. The room froze in time. You can smell. If you blink, you catch a fleeting, sickly whiff of decay. Barely there. The typical antiseptic smell of sal volatile, camphor, or eucalyptus, common in Victorian chambers to mask the last breaths of loved ones again. It dissipates almost immediately. You are close enough to feel the heat leave the body, yet the air remains oppressively still, as though absorbing the final pulse. You watch Victoria, her silhouette dim in candlelight, dark dress absorbing every flicker. She does not weep. Her grief is rigid, self-contained, an empire unto itself. After Albert's death, she would wear black for the remaining 40 years of her life. Ever the embodiment of mourning. She did not simply grieve, she became grief. You hover, silent. The royal diaries, 62 million words carved by her hand, later reveal the depth of her attachment. Forged by isolation and loss in childhood and adolescence, and centered on Albert as her anchor. But right now, there is no diary, only the whispered hush of mourning. You sense how it begins. Victoria insisted that Albert's apartments remain unchanged. Clocks stopped, clothes laid out as if awaiting him, toiletries untouched, his presence suspended in still life. In the blue room, a throne of absence, the mundane and the monumental intertwine, slippers where he last stood, a robe folded elegantly on a chair, a book open at a mid-line. You notice the physicality of his absence. The space he occupied is colder, the cushion a deeper indentation. Curtains hang unused, drawn in perpetual mourning, while portraits of them together catch the light. Victoria gazing at Albert with adoration. Copies commissioned soon after his death, as if to keep him present in light and memory. You feel her devotion as ritual, as obsession. She commissioned memorials. The Albert Memorial in Kensington Gardens, a soaring Gothic ciborium sheltering his statue, and the Royal Albert Hall. Both erected with public subscription yet shaped by her grief-fueled will. These were not just monuments, they were continuations of his presence, manifest in stone and music. You listen. Courtiers whisper beyond the room. Footsteps on polished wood seem muffled, reverent. The king's children, Queen Victoria's children, are summoned. She demands their proximity, perhaps to recreate domestic normalcy, or perhaps to feed collective grief. You sense tension in their footsteps, uncertainty in their glances. The grandeur of empire must not waver. Yet here grief reigns. You watch as the court becomes suspended. Victoria's withdrawal lasts over a decade, public life unraveling, the monarchy's sheen dimming. But you're present only in this moment, the birth of a cult of mourning. Rooted in flesh and shadow, you are drawn to the finer details that mark both devotion and decay. Hairwork, locks of Albert's hair woven into bracelets, brooches, mourning rings, a material tethered to memory, common in mid-Victorian mourning culture and given fresh prominence by the Queen herself. On the dressing table, upright stand several such tokens, the strands preserved under glass, the light catching skeins of chestnut strands. Entrapped and unchanging, you step closer. The candles gutter low, the wax dripping in slow bead drops, each a tiny coffin. The room's hush deepens. A door creaks softly somewhere, perhaps on its hinges, perhaps in the collective gasp of the household. Barely audible, you smell beeswax, the faint tang of black dye, mourning clothes that absorb all but sorrow. You feel the pull of time dilating. A second, an hour, a day. Victoria's grief stretches time into a void. You know that she later instructed that a plaster cast of Albert's hand, his dressing gown, even his cast hand, would become talismans she would sleep beside. Night after night, for decades, you sense the trajectory of obsession seated here. You observe a servant, placing a token, a ribbon, a letter, a pressed flower, from Albert near the pillows. You see, in that gesture, how a queen transforms mourning into ritual, a private act made perpetual. You note her gaze, hollow, determined, anchored in absence. There is no projection of future, only maintenance of memory. Later historians call it magnificent obsession. You stay, breathing quietly. The room is cold now by candlelight, but the air vibrates with unending devotion, as if Albert's presence is not quite gone. You see a veil laid over a stand, too elaborate for practical use. More an icon of sorrow. The threads of mourning envelop the space. You understand the paradox. Victoria was monarch of a modern, industrial empire, a symbol of progress, yet here, grief breeds archaic ritual. You sense the visceral clash, a world advancing in steam and reform, yet bound by grief, by stasis. You sense why this moment matters. You lean in, catching a crack in the quiet, the faintest tremor, a ragged exhale. Either the queen or the air itself surrenders. The flicker of reflection in her eyes betrays a humanity riven by devotion, overshadowed by loss. You leave the room, footsteps echoing. The doors click a punctuation to what you have seen. Outside, life continues. Horses in the stable, letters on sealed desks, ambassadors awaiting audience. But inside the blue room, time is suspended in mourning. You find yourself weeks after the death. Winter deepens. Britain's skies have turned an oppressive gray, the kind that swallows daylight early and leaves rooms dependent on oil lamps and the yellow flicker of tallow candles. In Windsor Castle and Osborne House alike, the air smells faintly of dust, damp stone, and dried flowers, remnants of funeral wreaths now brittle and brown. You are moving through a space that feels preserved, embalmed like the man it mourns. You enter the Queen's private apartments and see at once that nothing belonging to Prince Albert has been disturbed. This is deliberate. Servants dust around his possessions but do not move them. His shaving set, silver-handled brushes, a straight razor, a glass bottle still holding the faint trace of cologne, remains exactly where he last placed it. His clothes hang in the wardrobe, freshly pressed, as though he might return at any moment. It is a Victorian version of a shrine, and you are standing inside it. The bed she once shared with him is now half empty, yet not truly empty at all. Victoria orders that a photograph of Albert in life, along with a plaster cast of his hand, be placed on the pillow where his head would rest. Beside it, his dressing gown is laid out carefully, the sleeves positioned as if to receive the shape of arms. These objects are not simply mementos, they are stand-ins for his physical presence, arranged so that she might speak to him as if he were still alive. You hear the Queen's footsteps at irregular intervals. Sometimes she moves toward the blue room, where his body once lay in state before burial, pausing in the doorway to look in, to speak softly. Diaries and correspondence confirm that for years she insisted on maintaining these daily rituals. Fresh water placed in the room each morning, clothes laid out each evening. You realize the scale of her mourning is not days or weeks, but decades. You note the social cost. Ministers and courtiers whisper their concern. The Queen's prolonged seclusion damages the monarchy's visibility. She refuses most public appearances, conducting affairs of state from her private chambers, communicating through letters rather than audiences. Newspapers begin to refer to her as the Widow of Windsor, a title both sympathetic and critical. The British Newspaper Archive. You are aware of the public unease. An empire wants a sovereign to lead, not a mourner to retreat. You move through the corridors of Windsor Castle, where portraits of Albert line the walls. New commissions from court painters show him idealized, not the pale, fevered man of his last days, but a youthful consort in uniform or formal attire. They hang in places of prominence, not as history but as active presences. You feel watched, not by a ghost, but by a carefully maintained image. You notice the integration of mourning into state ritual. The court remains in black clothing far longer than protocol dictates. Mourning jewelry, jet brooches, onyx rings, lockets containing hair, becomes not only fashionable but emblematic of loyalty to the Queen. Shops in London's West End display such items prominently, supplying both genuine grief and imitation sentiment, in a museum. In the drawing rooms of the aristocracy, it becomes acceptable, even admirable, to display tokens of the dead. You pass the Queen's writing desk and glimpse open correspondence. She writes to her eldest daughter, Victoria, the Princess Royal in Prussia, describing her loneliness in the evenings, how she cannot bear to enter certain rooms, yet cannot let them remain closed. The language is factual yet saturated with longing. She does not sentimentalize his illness. Typhoid had been merciless, but she elevates his memory to a form of moral instruction for their children. You are there when the Queen orders the construction of memorials. The plans are laid on a large table, the Albert Memorial in Kensington Gardens, the Royal Mausoleum at Frogmore. She examines drawings by architect George Gilbert Scott, her gloved finger tracing the Gothic spire that will shelter Albert's likeness, historic England. The mausoleum is to be built not simply as a tomb but as a sanctuary, with marble, gilding, and mosaics depicting saints and virtues. You see in her eyes that this is not closure, this is continuation. You attend the dedication ceremonies, not as a guest but as a shadow among the crowd. The air smells of wet stone and iron. The city around the park hushed under an overcast sky. The Queen remains in her carriage, unseen, yet her influence is everywhere, in the black crape, in the solemn hymns, in the gold leaf lettering of Albert's name. You return with her to her private chambers, where the rituals continue unchanged. At Osborne House, she still has Albert's clothes brushed and aired, his writing desk kept stocked with paper, as though awaiting his hand. Servants are instructed to warm his rooms in winter, to open windows in summer. Even the water jug at his bedside is replenished daily. You observe the emotional toll. When the Queen does appear in public, rarely, it is in full mourning dress, black silk, jet beads, a widow's cap. Her face, pale and withdrawn, becomes an emblem of loss for the entire empire. But you also see the quiet resilience. She continues to sign papers, read reports, and meet ministers in her rooms. Grief has not made her incapable, only altered the way she reigns. You stand at the threshold one evening when she speaks aloud into an empty room, addressing Albert as if he were present. The words are intimate, not for record. You hear the timbre of a voice unused to answering silence, a voice that still waits for reply. You are reminded that this was a marriage not just of political convenience, but of personal devotion, an anchor to her sense of self. You note how mourning reshapes the monarchy's image. The public grows accustomed to a sovereign largely absent from ceremony, yet increasingly associated with moral steadfastness and domestic virtue. In an age where death was familiar, infant mortality high, epidemics frequent, her unyielding grief resonates. She becomes a model widow, even if it costs her political popularity. You look toward the future, sensing that this pattern will not end. The Queen will carry this ritualized presence of Albert into the final years of her reign, even into her coffin. Decades later, when she dies in 1901, attendants will find in her bedchamber not only personal effects but objects tied directly to him: his dressing gown, a plaster cast of his hand, photographs kept within arm's reach. You leave her apartments once more, passing through corridors where the air itself seems thickened by remembrance. Every object, Every room carries a residue of him, deliberately maintained, never allowed to fade. You understand now. This is not simply mourning. It is a constructed world in which the dead remain alive, not in spirit, but in habit, and you are inside it. You are now in the mid-1860s, several years after Albert's death, and yet the atmosphere inside Queen Victoria's residences has not shifted. The outside world has marched forward, railways expanded, telegraph lines stitched continents together, but here, within these walls, time remains arrested. The soundscape is subdued. The ticking of clocks deliberately stopped at 10:50 p.m. in the Blue Room. The rustle of skirts, the muffled scrape of a servant's shoes along waxed floors. Every noise is measured, as if the air might shatter if disturbed. You find the Queen at Windsor Castle, seated in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, surrounded by photographs of Albert. Some are formal portraits, others are intimate cartes de visite showing him with the children. She turns them over slowly, as if each cardboard mount were a doorway to a conversation left unfinished. You see the photograph's edges are worn from constant handling, oil from her fingertips leaving a patina no archivist could remove. Photography, still a relatively new medium, has become her lifeline to him. You witness her nightly ritual. Before retiring, she walks into the adjoining room where Albert once prepared for bed. His hairbrush lies on the dressing table. His shaving water is changed each evening by a valet. On the bed in her chamber, she places the plaster cast of his hand and his dressing gown beside her own pillow. These are not tucked away in storage, they are tactile presences. Her hands finding them in the dark. Court records and servant memoirs confirm these habits persisted for decades. Royal Collection Trust. You step back into the wider court, noting how her mourning has permeated every level of royal life. Staff wear black armbands or subdued colors. Even the palace menus reflect somber restraint. Large entertainments are rare. The court calendar, once punctuated by balls and levees, is sparsely marked. Ambassadors are received in small, private audiences rather than grand halls. You hear the tension in ministerial conversations. Prime Minister Lord Palmerston and others privately express concern about the monarchy's invisibility. Britain is a constitutional monarchy, dependent on public engagement as much as governance. Yet Victoria will not alter her habits. Her absence from the public sphere fuels Republican murmurs in the press. Though her moral image among ordinary Britons, especially widows, remains strong. British Newspaper Archive. You return with her to Osborne House in the summers. The light there is softer, filtered through tall windows and the salt haze off the Solent. Albert had loved this place, designed it with Italianate terraces and gardens. Now it is both a refuge and a reliquary. You notice in his study, untouched since 1861, the open ledger on his desk, a pen resting across the page as if awaiting his next entry. Even the inkpot is refreshed at intervals, its surface glinting black in the afternoon sun. You observe how these spaces serve as more than memory, they are a form of control. By keeping Albert's surroundings as they were, Victoria dictates the terms of his absence. He will never fade into the past because she will not allow time to rearrange him. It is a living archive, curated daily. You attend a private dinner, not as a guest, but as a silent witness. The table is set for one, yet two place settings are laid, one for the Queen, one for Albert. The second plate is never touched, the wineglass never raised, but it is there, an unspoken acknowledgement of his continued role at her side. Servants clear it away without remark at the meal's end. This practice, mentioned in memoirs of royal attendants, is part of the broader performance of presence. You sense how the children navigate this atmosphere. The elder sons and daughters have their own households, their own duties abroad, yet when they visit, they must adjust to the suspended time of their mother's grief. Some comply, some resist quietly, but none openly challenge her. To do so would be to deny the sanctity she has built. You travel with her to Balmoral in Scotland, a place rich with memories of their shared retreats. The Highland air is sharp, smelling of pine and peat smoke. Here too, Albert's rooms are preserved, his tartan, his walking stick, the fishing tackle he used on the River Dee. These are displayed not in glass cases, but in situ, as if he might return from an afternoon's outing. You note the peculiar mixture of comfort and unease such preservation brings. You are there when John Brown, a Scottish servant, begins to occupy a more prominent place in her daily life. His brusque honesty and loyalty earn her trust, yet his presence provokes gossip. Some see him as a companion easing her isolation, others whisper about impropriety. But you observe that even with Brown at her side, Albert's memory is never diminished. Brown is not a replacement, he is a guard of the shrine. You study the Queen's appearance. Black dresses in every season, occasionally relieved by white lace, but never by color, jet jewelry, mourning veils, and the miniature portrait of Albert she sometimes wears pinned to her bodice. Her public image becomes inseparable from the concept of mourning itself. Painters capture her as a widow monarch. Statues depict her veiled or solemn. The aesthetic of bereavement becomes part of Victorian cultural identity, influencing fashion far beyond the palace, V&A museum. You consider the medical perspective of the era. The concept of prolonged grief disorder did not exist. Instead, her behavior was interpreted through the lens of morality, piety, and devotion. Physicians might have noted the physical toll, her reduced appetite, recurring headaches, but there was no prescription for such loss. In a century when death was common, her mourning was exceptional only in its scale and duration. You walk again through the Blue Room at Windsor. Long after Albert's burial at Frogmore, it remains a place of daily ritual, fresh flowers on the table, bedclothes aired, windows open to change the air. The bed on which he died is still in place, the counterpane smoothed as if expecting a sleeper. You understand why visitors, even trusted relatives, are rarely admitted. This is not a tourist's room, it is a sanctum. You end the day following her into evening. She writes by lamplight, the scratching of her pen steady. Sometimes she writes to her daughters, sometimes to ministers, sometimes to Albert himself. Those letters are not sent, of course, but they are folded and stored in boxes marked with his initials. The act of writing seems to bridge the years between. You leave her chambers once more, stepping into corridors cooled by night. Beyond the palace walls, London's streets teem with life, costermongers calling their wares, hansom cabs rattling over cobbles, gas lamps glowing against the fog. But inside, the world is narrowed to two people, one living, one carefully kept from disappearing. And you are still here, a witness to the way grief can become architecture, a daily practice, a shadow that does not recede. You are in the late 1860s, and the Queen's life has hardened into a rhythm of ritualized mourning. Years have passed, but the rooms still breathe with Albert's presence as if time were an unwelcome guest barred from entering. You are moving again through Windsor Castle's private corridors, where sunlight filters through heavy damask curtains, muted into a dusky glow, as though even daylight is obliged to wear mourning. You step into the Queen's bedroom. The air is faintly perfumed with lavender and rosewater, fragrances she favors, but underneath lies the dry, papery scent of preserved flowers. On her night table, alongside her prayer book, rests the plaster cast of Albert's hand, its surface smoothed by decades of touch. His dressing gown is folded neatly beside her pillow, always within reach. You know from the records of her household that she would, on occasion, rest her cheek against it before sleep. Royal Collection Trust. You watch her mornings unfold. Before breakfast, she walks to the Blue Room where he died, now kept immaculate. A servant has already opened the curtains and replaced the flowers. On the bed lies the same counterpane, ironed and aired daily. The water jug is fresh, the towels folded, These gestures are carried out not for visitors, they are performed solely for him. Diaries of attendants describe the queen standing silently at the foot of the bed for several minutes before turning away without a word. You travel with her to Balmoral once more, where the Scottish air is sharp with peat smoke and pine. The rugged hills seem to hold the echo of their shared rides and picnics. Here, his rooms are untouched. Boots still by the door, fishing rods propped against a wall, his writing desk arranged with papers as he left them. Even in this remote estate, the same daily rituals are enforced. You sense the court adapting to her habits. Servants know to prepare 2 sets of towels, 2 sets of clothes brushes, one for the living sovereign, one for the absent consort. When questioned, they answer with the same phrase, "For His Royal Highness." The practice is not questioned, it has become part of the monarchy's functioning. As much as any state ceremony, you note how her grief influences public life. The grand balls and evening courts that once marked the social calendar are absent. The London season, still lively among the aristocracy, now unfolds without the monarch's presence. Theaters, galleries, and charitable events lament her absence. Yet in the popular imagination, her devotion to Albert strengthens her image as the moral matriarch of the empire. The newspapers print engravings of her in widow's dress, accompanied by sentimental verses, reinforcing the cult of bereavement. British Newspaper Archive. You observe her letters to ministers. They are precise, sometimes brusque, but punctuated with references to what the prince would have thought, or what Albert would have advised. Policy discussions, from army reform to colonial governance, are filtered through this imagined consultation. The dead consort remains an active participant in the affairs of state, an unseen advisor whose counsel exists in her memory. You walk with her through the grounds of Windsor, past the chapel where Albert's coffin had rested before its final journey to the royal mausoleum at Frogmore. She visits Frogmore often, making the short trip in a carriage with blinds drawn. Inside the mausoleum, the marble effigies of Albert and Victoria lie side by side, carved by the sculptor Carlo Marichetti. You stand in the cool air, smelling the faint dampness of stone and the beeswax used to polish the gilt. She kneels there in silence, gloved hands resting on the edge of the tomb. You realize how mourning has become a language in her life, with its own grammar and ritual objects. The black crepe dresses, the jet jewelry, the memorial portraits, the preserved rooms, all are words in this private vocabulary, and you are learning to read it. You witness the Queen receiving foreign dignitaries in her preferred setting, small, dimly lit rooms hung with portraits of Albert. They sit beneath his gaze while she speaks of alliances and treaties. This is not accidental. She ensures that any political conversation happens in the company of his image. Even her diplomacy is staged in the theater of mourning. You hear the servants' accounts, how, when traveling between residences, Albert's clothes and personal effects are transported as if he were still alive. His dressing case, his favorite chair, and sometimes the plaster hand are packed carefully and placed in rooms before her arrival. This allows her rituals to continue without interruption. No matter the location, you watch her interactions with her children. Now grown, she instructs them on duty, often invoking Albert's name. Their marriages, public roles, even private conduct are measured against what Papa would have expected. The children carry their own memories of him, but in her presence, those memories are subsumed into her narrative, a version of Albert frozen in the perfection of loss. You notice the subtle shift in her health. The years of restricted movement, combined with the weight of constant grief, have left her shorter of breath, more easily fatigued. Physicians note her ailments, rheumatism, problems with her eyesight, but there is no remedy they can offer for the condition that shapes them all: her refusal to let the dead go. You are there on anniversaries, of his birth, of their wedding, of his death, when the rituals intensify. Special flowers are placed in his rooms. his portraits garlanded. She may withdraw entirely for the day, seeing no one. The servants know these dates by heart, their own schedules bending around the Queen's acts of remembrance. You begin to understand that this is no temporary phase. Her obsession has passed beyond mourning into something structural, like the foundations of the buildings she inhabits. Removing it would bring collapse. In the architecture of her days, Albert is the load-bearing wall. You leave her presence at night, stepping out into the palace corridors where the lamps burn low and the carpets swallow sound. Somewhere beyond these walls, the world is modernizing. Electric telegraphs hum. New factories open. Parliament debates new laws. But here, in these rooms, the year is always 1861. The month always December. And you, still unseen, still silent, remain a witness to the unbroken line between love and death. You step into the 1870s, more than a decade after Albert's death, and yet the fabric of daily life within Queen Victoria's private sphere is still stitched with him. The rest of Britain pulses with the dynamism of the industrial age. Railway networks densify. Cities swell. New technologies glitter at exhibitions, but here, in her chambers, progress halts at the threshold. You can almost feel the temporal divide, as if you've crossed from the living world into a curated reliquary. You enter the Blue Room at Windsor once again. The bed is dressed exactly as it was on the night he died. The counterpane smooth, the pillows plumped, the water jug is freshly filled. The towels are folded with precise edges. You recall from attendants' memoirs that the task is done without fail. Every single day, whether the Queen is in residence or not, dust never settles here. Neglect is unthinkable. The preservation is not for public view but for her alone. You watch her prepare for a journey to Balmoral. Albert's belongings are packed alongside her own. His traveling case, his favorite armchair, and small framed photographs are carefully wrapped and carried ahead so that when she arrives, his presence can be reconstructed in those Scottish rooms. Servants treat these objects not as relics but as part of an active household. In her eyes, the king consort is simply in another room, another state, but not gone. You travel north with her. The Highland air cuts sharp in your lungs, scented with pine and wet heather. Balmoral feels like a preserved memory. His boots still stand near the door. A riding crop leans against the wall. His fishing gear rests beside the fireplace. She walks these rooms slowly, touching the back of his chair, pausing to gaze through the windows at the hills he once loved. Even the walks they took together are retraced, as if repetition might stitch the present to the past. You notice her reliance on ritual intensifying during these years. Anniversaries of his birth, their wedding, and his death are marked with deliberate ceremony. Fresh flowers are placed in each of his rooms. Sometimes she orders particular arrangements based on his preferences: white lilies, roses, violets. The scent is heady in the enclosed spaces, clinging to curtains and upholstery. She may spend entire days in seclusion, seeing no one but her most trusted attendants. You are present when John Brown's role deepens. The tall, plain-spoken Scottish servant moves through her rooms without the deference others display, speaking to her with blunt honesty. He brings her outdoors, onto the heather paths Albert once walked, and he becomes both a buffer against the demands of state and a guardian of her private rituals. You note the gossip this provokes, rumors of inappropriate closeness, speculations about his influence, but you can see plainly that his presence does not diminish Albert's. If anything, he is absorbed into the ritual framework, another part of the machinery of remembrance. You walk with her through Osborne House during summer. The Italianate terraces still look out over the Solent, just as Albert had designed. His study is untouched, papers neatly stacked, pens arranged in a straight line, a pair of reading glasses folded beside a ledger. A faint smell of old paper and wood polish hangs in the air. You know this arrangement is no accident. Servants are instructed to clean around these objects without disturbing their placement. You sense how the public's perception of her mourning has shifted. In the early years, it was met with sympathy, even reverence. By now, some political commentators and members of parliament are impatient. The absence of the monarch from public ceremonies has weakened visibility, and the Prime Minister is forced to reassure the nation that she still governs actively. But among ordinary people, especially widows and those who have lost children, her constancy remains a source of admiration. In a culture familiar with death, her refusal to let go is read as loyalty, not pathology. You are in the room when she reads aloud from Albert's speeches and writings to her younger children and grandchildren. She wants them to hear his words, to know his mind, and to measure themselves against his ideals. Her voice is steady, but you detect an undercurrent, a desire not just to preserve memory, but to animate it, to keep him in the present tense. You visit the royal mausoleum at Frogmore with her. The building, completed years earlier, is richly decorated. Marble effigies of Albert and Victoria lying side by side. Intricate mosaics, gilded details. The air inside is cool and still, smelling faintly of damp stone and the beeswax polish used on the woodwork. She kneels at the tomb, remaining motionless for long stretches, as though in conversation. When she finally rises, her eyes are red, but her expression is composed. You notice how mourning has shaped her personal surroundings. Every palace and retreat she inhabits has its Albert rooms, spaces that remain exactly as he left them. These are not shown to the public. They are not museum exhibits. They are active components of her life, maintained with the same care as her own chambers. You reflect on the physical toll. Decades of limited public activity, combined with her weight gain and rheumatic complaints, have made her slower to move. Her eyesight has dimmed. Physicians attend her regularly, prescribing tonics and rest, but they cannot alter the fundamental structure of her existence. The unyielding daily rituals anchor her, even as they isolate her. You are present during an audience with a foreign envoy. She receives him in a small drawing room, where a large portrait of Albert dominates one wall. As they speak, she refers to Albert in the present tense. The prince thinks, or the prince would advise, as if he were a silent partner at the meeting. The envoy glances at the portrait more than once, uncertain where the true seat of influence lies. You begin to understand the permanence of this state. This is not grief awaiting resolution. This is the architecture of her reign now, a monarchy infused with personal bereavement, projected into every room, every meeting, every public absence. You leave her presence once more, stepping into the outer corridors where the light is brighter, the air fresher. Beyond these walls, the empire continues to expand. Railways whistle, factories churn, but you know that when you return to her chambers tomorrow, or in 10 years, they will look exactly as they do today. And you will still be a witness to a life lived beside a memory. You are in the closing years of the 19th century, and yet within Queen Victoria's private apartments. It is still December 1861. 4 decades have passed since Albert's final breath, but the spaces he once touched remain frozen in the moment of his departure. You are moving once more through Windsor Castle's long corridors, past portraits draped in shadow. Toward the blue room, you step inside. The bed is made precisely, the counterpane smooth, the pillows plumped, the water jug is full, towels folded with knife-edge precision. The curtains are drawn back to let in winter light, which falls across the same furniture, the same arrangement of personal items. The air smells faintly of lavender and starch. There is no dust. A servant has already been in this morning, as they have every day for 40 years, to keep the room as if awaiting his return. You see the Queen standing at the foot of the bed. Her hair is white now, her figure heavier, but she is still in black. The jet beads at her throat catch the light with a dull gleam. She stands in silence, gloved hands clasped in front of her. No one speaks. After several minutes, she turns and leaves without looking back. This has been her ritual for decades, an unbroken thread through changing governments, wars, jubilees, and technological revolutions. You follow her to Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, her seaside refuge. Here, Albert's study remains untouched, papers neatly stacked, pens aligned, his chair positioned exactly as he left it. The air holds the scent of wood polish and salt carried on the breeze from the Solent. In the adjoining bedroom, his clothes are still hung, brushed, and ready. Even in the royal yacht's cabins, a space is kept for him, his items stowed as if he might board at any moment. You witness the continued role of John Brown's memory. Even after his death in 1883, Brown had been her constant companion for nearly 2 decades, guarding the Queen's privacy and enabling her mourning rituals. After his passing, she mourned him too, placing a photograph of him in her rooms, but his absence only deepened her return to the central figure of Albert. No one, living or dead, displaced the consort. You were present during state affairs conducted in private rooms still dominated by Albert's image. Ambassadors and ministers sit beneath portraits and busts of him, their presence a constant reminder that the Queen's decisions are still tethered to an imagined dialogue with her husband. Even her golden and diamond jubilee celebrations are colored by this, moments when the world sees her. But always in black, always under the gaze of his likeness. You notice the physical toll. Age and limited mobility have made her slower. She uses a small wheeled chair to move through the palace. But she still insists on visiting Albert's rooms herself. Physicians tend to her arthritis, her failing eyesight, her occasional shortness of breath, but there is no remedy for the structure of her life, which remains built around absence. You are there in January 1901 at Osborne House. The Queen is visibly weaker now, confined more often to bed. On her bedside table are the objects she has kept close for decades, the plaster cast of Albert's hand, his dressing gown, a photograph of him taken in 1861. In her final days, she requests that certain items be placed in her coffin, a lock of Albert's hair, one of his dressing gowns, and the plaster cast of his hand. She also orders that her wedding veil be laid over her face. You watch as her attendants obey these final instructions. When she dies on the 22nd of January 1901, the room is quiet except for the ticking of the clock and the shuffling of footsteps. The items are placed with care, alongside mementos of her children and of John Brown. Albert, in death, is as close to her as he had been in life, or closer. You follow the funeral procession to Frogmore, where she will be laid to rest beside Albert in the royal mausoleum. The cold air carries the scent of damp earth and cut flowers. Inside the mausoleum, the marble effigies of husband and wife wait, side by side. In the dim light, the sound of muffled voices and the creak of wood on stone echo off the high, decorated ceiling. You remain a witness as the coffin is lowered into the vault, alongside the man whose absence defined her life. The air is cool and still. Dust motes drift in the beams of light filtering through stained glass. The heavy doors close, sealing the space. Above ground, the mausoleum returns to its quiet vigil over the decades, its doors opening only for maintenance or remembrance. You step outside into the winter air. The ceremony is over. The mourners depart. Yet within these walls, Albert and Victoria are reunited, not in the stasis of preserved rooms, but in the permanence of stone. You realize what you have seen is not simply a story of grief. It is the construction of a life's architecture around loss, maintained with the discipline of statecraft and the intimacy of marriage. For 40 years, Victoria ruled an empire while living beside a memory, turning mourning into a daily act as fixed as the rising sun. You walk away from the mausoleum. Behind you, the stone walls conceal the 2 figures, one who died young, one who carried that death to her own. Before you, the path winds back into the living world, where voices, movement, and change resume. But in your mind, the rooms remain. the blue room's smooth bedspread, the untouched study, the scent of lavender over starched linen, the silent form of a plaster hand waiting beside a pillow. Time will erode the buildings, the portraits, even the marble effigies, but the image you carry will not fade. You have been a witness. You stand alone now, the last of the mourners having drifted away from Frogmore. The winter air is crisp, sharp in your lungs, carrying the faint smell of damp earth and cut evergreens left at the graves. Behind you, the royal mausoleum stands silent, its domed roof and gilded details glowing faintly in the low sun. Inside, marble effigies lie side by side, husband and wife, carved in serene repose. They will not age now. They will not move. They are bound together in stone, just as they were bound together in life and in mourning. You walk the grounds slowly, past the frozen lawns, the bare branches rattling in the wind. Somewhere far off, the muted clang of a gardener's spade meeting frost-hardened soil echoes. Here, away from the corridors of Windsor, away from the crowded drawing rooms of Osborne, the air feels different. No smell of polished wood or lavender-scented linen, only earth and cold air. The simplicity is almost startling. You think of the rooms you have seen, rooms preserved for 40 years. Not as historical exhibits, but as active parts of a living woman's life. The blue room at Windsor, with its perfectly made bed and water jug refilled daily. Albert's study at Osborne, untouched since 1861. The boots by the door at Balmoral. They were never meant to be visited by strangers. They existed for her alone. Part of the daily performance of presence. And you understand now that these rituals were not merely sentiment, they were architecture. The very shape of her days was built around them. You remember the scent of those rooms. Lavender and starch, wood polish and paper, the faintest trace of dustless stillness. And underneath, something less definable, the absence made tangible, the air too perfect, too still. The preservation became a kind of embalming, not of the body, but of time itself. You reflect on the paradox of her reign. In public memory, Queen Victoria is the widow in black, an image so enduring it overshadows the young queen she once was. Her devotion became a symbol, shaping Victorian culture's fascination with mourning jewelry, memorial photography, and elaborate funerary rites. Yet this same devotion drew criticism. Her withdrawal from public duties sparked political unease. She reigned over an empire that prided itself on progress, while in her private life, she resisted the forward march of time. And yet, for all the empire's reach, her deepest work was in the maintenance of a single absence. You return your gaze to the mausoleum. The doors are shut now, the lock heavy. Inside, the air is cool and still. The marble effigies will rest beneath their arched canopy as decades turn into centuries. Perhaps the colors in the mosaics will fade. Perhaps the gold leaf will dull. But for now, they hold their vigil, side by side. You imagine the Queen's final moments in January 1901, her white hair spread on the pillow, the wedding veil over her face, the plaster cast of Albert's hand placed beside her, the lock of his hair tucked into her coffin. These were not tokens for the living, they were offerings for the dead, carried into the silence where she had lived for 40 years. You take a final step back, the mausoleum growing smaller in your view. The path leads toward the world that moves forward. Steam trains still run. Telegraphs still hum. Factories still churn. But behind you, the world inside those rooms remains fixed, unmoving. For Victoria, death was not an event, it was a companion. The blue room will eventually change. The servants who refreshed the water and smoothed the counterpane are long gone. Dust will come, paint will flake. But the story remains. A queen who reigned over an empire, yet lived beside a corpse, not in the literal sense, but in the daily, deliberate act of keeping the dead alive. You understand now why this story clings. It is not only about love, nor only about grief. It is about the way a single absence can become a life's defining presence. It is about the lengths to which we go to keep the past within reach. Even when the world demands we let it go, you turn away at last. You are not a tourist in time. You are a witness, and what you have remembered will never leave you again.